What's up, guys? It's Dakota, and today we're going to be going over something new, something I haven't really gone over before on my channel, and we're actually going to dive into Standard instead of Modern for a change. Since Rotation happened a while ago, and with the introduction of Guilds of Ravnica, things have been pretty sweet in Standard. We've had tons and tons and tons of decks. We still have the best deck in the format, which is the one I'm going to go over today, what many people think is the best format, or best deck in the format. But in reality, it's not like the standards before where we had the best deck and everyone else was playing something else. This is one of the decks that you can play, and you don't have to play it if you want to find success in the standard format. So without further ado, we'll just dive right into this deck tech of Golgari Midrange, which basically is supposed to grind out your opponent and basically get value from all of your creatures, your planeswalkers, and really just kind of run them out of answers, and then eventually you can just take over the game. This is what we would call, a mid-range deck. So mid-range basically meaning that it's not aggressive, it's not trying to kill you right away, but not a control deck in the sense of like counter spells, but really just trying to get to the middle part of the game, the later turns of the game, not trying to go to turn like 30 and 40 per se, but definitely not trying to win the game on turn 3 or turn 4. So kind of just going to start the creatures and work my way down through here. Llanowar Elves is 3 of them in this deck, and for a pretty good reason to play Llanowar Elves in a deck like this instead of just trying to go up 1, 2, 3, 4 through the turns and like ramp yourself up to your 3 drops. You have Jadelight Ranger, which lets you explore twice, and this is where this deck can kind of pivot and decide, well, do I want to be a more aggressive deck? Again, not trying to win the game on turn 3 or turn 4 shouldn't be your mindset when playing this deck, but you can have those aggressive draws where you play Jadelight Ranger on turn 2, and this thing could just be a 4-3, and really just kind of start hitting your opponent on turn 3 onwards, and also just being a big body kind of just locks down the board really good too. So kind of a draw to playing Llanowar Elf is the fact that you can play a 3-drop like Jadelight Ranger or a Midnight Reaper even on turn 2 and just kind of start getting some value that way. Merfolk Branchwalker and Seeker Squire kind of play this same role, only instead their power and toughnesses are really flipped. When they enter the battlefield, they explore, and kind of the draw to playing these cards and to really kind of leverage the game and give you some game against like the white-right aggro decks that are also in the format, the mono-red decks, the burn decks, everything, is to play Wild Growth Walker, which is a 2-drop, 1/3. Whenever a creature you control explores, you can put a +1/+1 counter on it, and you gain 3 life. Obviously, we know gaining life against the super aggressive decks, and especially the burn decks, kind of blanking some of their spells. Usually it's game over once Wild Growth Walker hits the battlefield, and then you play like a Jadelight Ranger, or even like a few, like a Merfolk Branchwalker and a Seeker Squire. Even one of these, gaining 3 life and getting a 2/4 on the battlefield is really good. It blocks really well against a lot of those decks, and they usually have to like 2-for-1 themselves just to get rid of a Wild Growth Walker if they have no way to deal with it once this guy comes down. Looking at all these other creatures, Carnage Tyrant, probably one of the best creatures you can be playing in the format, if not the best creature you can play in the format. One of the 2 6-drop uncounterable things that you should be playing, that being Niv Mizzet, which I'll dive into. Jeskai Control, another deck in the format, I would say is probably like the number 2 best deck, if not the best deck in the format. Carnage Tyrant can be countered, trample hexproof. Really, the only reliable way to kill this thing in the format right now is Settle the Wreckage and Cleansing Nova. There's some other ways that you can make them sacrifice it, but in reality, the cards that people are playing and the most common cards are those 2 right there. And like we said, this deck is about leveraging your position and really getting as much value as you can. And while Settle the Wreckage doesn't play nice with Midnight Reaper because Reaper wants your creatures to die, Cleansing Nova does. So even if you play a Carnage Tyrant and you've went up this ladder of like you have 4 or 5 creatures on the battlefield, you have like 2 or 3 cards in hand, and then they Cleansing Nova you're fine with that as long as you have a Midnight Reaper on the battlefield, because then you just get to, you lose 5 life, and in those matchups where you're playing like the control deck, you're fine with losing a life. They're probably going to kill you in just one turn anyway, or over a few turns with Niv Mizzet. So the fact that you just get to draw 5 cards, you lose 5 life, you refill your hand, and you're good to go. And if they are doing that, you have cards like Fine Finale, which kind of transitions as well into these other spells that you're playing. Fine Finality, fine getting 2 creatures from your graveyard, returning them to your hand. Very good, especially if you get your board wiped, or just trying to like cycle through creatures. Like you still have like a Wild Growth Walker on the battlefield. You pick up Jade Light Ranger and a Merfolk Branch Walker, or Jade Light Ranger and a Carnage Tyrant, or 2 Carnage Tyrants, something like that. Your graveyard then becomes kind of like a toolbox and a place where, you know, instead of having 3 copies of Carnage Tyrant, you now have 6 copies essentially of Carnage Tyrant, or you have 7 copies of Merfolk Branch, something like that. Just a way to kind of pick up those utility creatures, and you get to use them again and again, kind of churning through your deck to reach kind of your big payoff cards like Carnage Tyrant and Vivian Reed. Kind of a card that they experimented with, but now kind of thrown in, and probably one of my favorite cards that's in Standard and should find a home in some of these mid-range decks is Karn. Karn gives you card advantage. Like most of the time, if he's just a 4-mana, draw 2 cards. Usually if you're minusing to get a card, that card's probably pretty good in the situation. If not, you're probably fine with drawing a land or the second worst card that Karn gives you. He can also make these tokens, while maybe not relevant all the time, but just being able to put bodies on the battlefield and protect himself and give you something to kind of help swing races or gum up the ground the best you can in the mirror matches, or just putting pressure on the board against the other control decks or the decks that are trying to play a little bit later of a game. Karn can kind of do it all. The only downside being you're not really playing any other artifacts in the deck, so the constructs kind of only help themselves out. But again, with the value that you can get from Karn, you can easily just grind people out even with just 1 copy of Karn. Vivian Reed, who is kind of like, I would say, an all-star in this deck, to say the least. Lets you dig for creatures or lands. Even if she just, for 5 mana, finds you a land with her +1, that gives you 6 mana, which you need to cast Carnage Tyrant, which sometimes can just be your best card in any matchup. Her minus, destroying an artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying, really important when you have a format with Lyra Dawnbringers and even other flyers, Shalai being another one that comes to mind. Artifacts, enchantments, I mean, blowing up an Ixalan's Binding or a Conclave Tribunal to get back one of your creatures, or to get back even like Karn or anything like that. Just get anything that's hidden underneath of that, so you can start casting your spells again and really just kind of blank in terms a removal spell from your opponent. And the emblem, which is usually game over, really the only thing that gets you at this point is a Settle the Wreckage, or a way that they just make you sacrifice all your creatures, what have you. You get an emblem with creatures you control, get +2/+2, have Vigilance, Trample, and Indestructible, obviously making your really big offensive creatures bigger, more offensive, and more resilient, being indestructible, where even a Seeker Squire without a counter is a 3/4 indestructible Vigilance Trampler that your opponent has to deal with, and even if they can block it, and that's probably not too good for them because they still won't be able to kill it. They're basically just trying to stop themselves from dying. Going back to the spells, you're playing Cast Down. Other than the Lyra Dawnbringers and Niv Mizzets in the format, I mean, Cast Down hits a lot of the creatures that people are playing. A lot of the red-white aggro decks, I mean, some of them play Tajik, other ones play Aurelia, but in the grand scheme of things, being able to kill their Benelish Marshals, being able to pressure their other smaller creatures that may have gotten bigger, and just kind of be able to punch through the last points of damage, or to just unmuck the ground so you can actually attack and make your Carnage Tyrant attacks more of them blocking to not die, not blocking so they can kill your 7/6. And Vraska's Contempt, a very good way just to get rid of Planeswalkers, very efficient, instant speed, even can get rid of creatures and gain you some life. Again, in those like burn type matchups, that's just a way that you can race them, you can make their lives a little bit more difficult, even with just gaining that 2 life and tempoing them by killing an Adanto Vanguard, or exiling an Adanto Vanguard. As far as the lands go, pretty self-explanatory, I would say. 4 Woodland Cemetery, 4 Overgrown Tomb, just dual lands. Most of the time comes into play untapped, being a 2-color mana base. Woodland Cemetery, aside from turn 1, is almost always going to come into play untapped, unless something crazy happens, which in whatever case, like you're playing Woodland Cemetery on turn 1. And with only your real turn 1 play being Llanowar Elves, the fact that you have essentially 9, 10, 12 lands that come into play turn 1, either tapped or that don't produce green mana, is fine, because if you don't have turn 1 Llanowar Elf, your game plan isn't shot. You're obviously able to leverage that and go into the late game. Talking about some of the utility lands, or really just 2 of the utility lands in here, Memorial to Folly lets you have a one-shot find, and just picks up a creature from your graveyard, puts it into your hand. Very good when you're just trying to slam Carnage Tyrant, swing in, they kill it, they trade off like 4 of their creatures for your 1 Carnage Tyrant. Well, guess what? You can just bring it right back, and they're back to figuring out how to deal with this big dumb dino. Picking up Chupacabra to kill something, Midnight Reaper to grind out more value, Jadelight Rangers and Seeker Squires, whatever, try to dig a card deeper, things like that. And Detection Tower, a card that kind of hedges in the mirror matches, because I feel like it's kind of free, getting to play 24 lands, 23 of them produce color. You have room for at least one land that can not produce a color, and Detection Tower is a pretty good one. You can pay 1 and tap it, and your opponent's creatures and your opponents lose hexproof and can be the targets of spells or abilities as if they didn't have hexproof. Works really well against Carnage Tyrant, opening up all your Chupacabras, your Vraska's, your Vraska's Contempts, your cast downs, things like that. Just makes Carnage Tyrant actually targetable in a way that you can swing the mirror match in your favor if it comes down to just running dinos into each other. The sideboard, and always if you're planning on playing this kind of deck, tune your sideboard to where you're going to be playing, but I'll be going over this kind of as a good way to show you what cards you should be playing in your sideboard and what cards you should consider and kind of what matchups they're for. Duress, look at your opponent reveals their hand, you choose an non-creature online card from it, they discard it. Really good against like the control matchups, decks that are trying to be more combo based and focused. Take their counter spell, take their removal spell, something like that, and it kind of just tempos them out of the game and forces them to use their resources to try to find another one to deal with it, and then use those cards to kind of push forward their game plan, hit their land drops, and eventually get their win condition on the battlefield to take over the game. One card that I really like in general in this format and other formats outside of Standard, Assassin's Trophy, I feel like doesn't get enough love. It can destroy any permanent an opponent controls, and they search their library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield. While obviously not good against the deck that's struggling on mana, just the fact that this can hit in the mirror match, like their memorials, their detection towers, just as like a few things, just even their lands, like that's good for almost, it feels like a win for you when you can just play Carnage Tyrant and you know that they don't have a way to get rid of it, or when you kill one of their Carnage Tyrants, that's another card that they can't get back because obviously the Memorial of Follies in their graveyard, there's no way to pick it back up or pick up any of their creatures. I would say maybe play 2 or 3 Assassin's Trophy, probably could fit 1 or 2 in the main, shuffling some things around, but I feel like this card doesn't get enough love, but it is just an example of how good this card can be in a sideboard. Just being able to blow up utility lands can feel like a win, and even just blowing up a planeswalker is fine too. And it's cheap to I mean, 2 mana, destroy any permanent, and they get a basic land for it. I mean, I feel like that's still great. More cast downs. I mean, we kind of seen through even just the creatures here, like, again, more mirror matchy type stuff, aggro decks. There's only a few legendary creatures that see consistent play, and playing cast down as just essentially a Doomblade of sorts. Still very good. Still very, very good. Kills 99 to 95% of the creatures in standard that people are going to be playing, and those few that you can't deal with, you have Assassin's Trophy, Vraska's Contempt, and even down farther here, like Playcrafter. Very good ways of just dealing with those creatures anyway. So playing more cast downs is fine and probably encouraged as well. The 4th copy of Wild Growth Walker, a card that again is very good against the super aggressive decks, the burn decks, eventually just becomes a thing that gains you life, makes it harder for them to kill you, and then obviously makes it harder for them to attack, because once this thing gets up to a 3/5, then they do have some ways of dealing with it post board, but in reality, like, they want to be using their answers to get through damage and really just take you off of blockers while this Wild Growth Walker is still in play. They deal with a 3/5, but they still have a 4/3 that they have to try to beat through. So I mean, that Wild Growth Walker's there for just to kind of muck up the ground some more and really kind of put the screws to those super aggressive decks. Midnight Reaper, probably another control, a card that you want to bring in for the control decks, and possibly even the mirror. Again, just the fact that this card can give you a ton of cards, and the fact that you have some ways to gain life and kind of mitigate that life loss by drawing 7 cards. You're very likely to hit a Vraska's Contempt or even a Wild Growth Walker or something, a way just to kind of gain that life back and offset the fact of that it deals damage to you. You just get those cards and gain that life right back. Playcrafter, I'm not really sure why it's here. You can play it against like the control decks. They play their Niv Mizzet. They really don't have a way to protect it, and they end up having to sacrifice it, and obviously it's a win for you. Other times, if they just don't have anything, then they discard a card, and it makes them deal with a Planeswalker too, so even just getting rid of a Teferi or a Ralzeric or even a Vivian Reed or a Karn, something like that, is pretty good. It can be pretty good. It has its spots. I'm not super high on the card, but I'm sure people smarter than me know what's going on, and there's a reason why this card is a 2-of in this deck, and Assassin's Trophy is a 1-of, for example. Moving along, Thrashing Brontodon, another way to deal with those enchantments and artifacts that just kind of deal with your other creatures or other permanents on your board. Get back a Vivian Reed, get back a Chupacabra even, or Midnight Reaper, something, a way that you can just blow up problem enchantments or artifacts and even be able to get it back with cards like Memorial to Folly or even Find Finality as well, as a way to just to kind of have a constant recursive artifact and enchantment destruction spell. And then another Karn and Doom Whisperer. These 2 cards, like Karn again, if you really just want to keep being grindy and attrition-y, bring this card in. Very good at just giving you cards, and eventually can just minus to get a card back that you really want instead of just digging deeper into your deck. And Doom Whisperer, just a big creature, can set up draws. Again, like, you can pay life to activate its ability, be able to put like creatures in the graveyard that you can get back with Find Finality, and then shore up your draws to either draw lands or even just draw whatever cards that you surveil on top, not necessarily having to dump them, and giving you something to just pay life into when the game sort of starts to stall out and you really just need a haymaker to try to win the game. And conveniently enough, doesn't die to the back half of Finality, even if you don't put the counters on it. So that's kind of a super rough overview of Golgari Midrange. My thoughts, I like the deck. I'm a fan of grindy creature decks trying to do what I would say is unfun things. There's people trying to do unfair things, and there's people doing fair things. This is really fair, and it's in that range of what it's doing as a fair deck is very, it's very powerful. It's got a perfect game plan to leverage those fair things while also being able to keep the other decks in check, but not doing them so much better than everyone else that it is unbeatable, and that if you're not playing this deck, then you aren't going to win, or that you aren't going to be very successful. So it's kind of great how all of these decks have been balanced, and even with a deck that's trying to stop everyone from doing either the more unfair things or trying to be beat down decks, whatever, doesn't discourage them from not doing that and pick up this deck, but still has game against those decks and not just easily getting run over. But that's going to wrap it up here for Golgari Midrange for Standard. Be on the lookout for more videos coming for Standard. This format's great. Going to be starting streaming Arena soon, playing a few decks, grinding, trying to eventually build more of these Standard decks and get ready for Ravnica Allegiance that comes out next month. Probably going to be drafting that and just having a lot of fun. The Standard format's great. It's been terrible for a while. There are some fun decks, but all the other fun decks kind of were discouraged from doing their thing from other powerful decks, and I'm glad while this deck is powerful, it's not discouraging people from playing other strategies in the format, and kind of allows them to do their thing, but also not to the point where this kind of just gets run over. So yeah, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, comment down below what deck that you would like to see next, if there's a anything that I might have missed from the Golgari deck, things that I should know as a player, like maybe why Assassin's Trophy is only one of them in the sideboard and there's more Playcrafters than Assassin's Trophies, things like that. I would greatly appreciate it, anything to become a better player, and I hope that these kind of help you get in the mindset and maybe even convince you to join Standard if you're not already playing it, because this format's sweet. But anyway, now that's going to do it for me. I'll see you guys in the next video.